It was July 15th, and our group of friends arrived at the secluded campsite nestled in the Colorado mountains. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the clearing where we set up our tents. The trees surrounding us were tall and dense, their dark silhouettes almost merging with the night sky. We lit a campfire, the flames crackling and dancing, providing a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. As we settled around the fire, our laughter and stories filled the air, mixing with the sounds of chirping crickets. The camp had a welcoming feel to it, though there was an underlying eeriness in the stillness of the night. We talked about the various legends and ghost stories associated with the area, which only added to the suspenseful atmosphere. Suddenly, a shiver ran down my spine as I noticed how quiet the forest had become, our voices almost echoing unnaturally. The thought of being so isolated began to sink in, making the campfire seem like a fragile barrier against the vast, dark forest. The excitement of the first night soon gave way to an uneasy anticipation of what lay ahead. As I tried to shake off the feeling, I noticed Lucas eyeing something near the edge of the clearing. It looked like he had spotted something out of place. With a sense of curiosity and slight apprehension, we all turned to see what had caught his attention. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Lucas was already up and exploring the area near the campsite. He had mentioned he'd found something unusual while we were still groggy with sleep. We followed him to a spot behind the tents, where he had uncovered an old, weathered diary buried under a pile of leaves. The diary was bound in cracked leather, and its pages were yellowed with age. Lucas carefully opened it, revealing handwritten entries from someone who had camped here decades ago. The entries spoke of strange occurrences and a sudden disappearance of a previous camp group. We all gathered around, fascinated and a little unnerved by the eerie details. As we read through the diary, the air seemed to grow colder, and an unsettling silence enveloped us. The stories of unexplained noises and shadowy figures began to feel all too real. A sense of dread crept in, mingling with our curiosity, as the diary described the exact location where we were now camping. By the time we finished reading, the excitement from last night was replaced by an uneasy tension. The once cheerful campfire stories now felt more like warnings. We decided to investigate further, but a shiver ran through me as I glanced at the dense forest surrounding us, feeling as though we were being watched. The day passed uneventfully, but an undercurrent of tension lingered among us. By evening, we decided to take a break from the unsettling diary and explore further into the woods. We had found a map in the diary that hinted at an abandoned cabin not far from our camp. The idea of uncovering more about the mysterious past intrigued us, despite the creeping sense of unease. As twilight settled, we ventured into the forest, flashlights in hand. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows on the ground. Our footsteps echoed through the woods, each crunch of leaves and snap of twigs amplified in the stillness. The deeper we went, the more the forest felt like a living entity, watching us with unseen eyes. After what felt like hours, we finally spotted the cabin, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. It was a decrepit structure, its wooden planks rotting and the windows broken. The air around it was colder, and a shiver ran down my spine as we approached. The once sturdy cabin now seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. We hesitated at the threshold, a mix of fear and curiosity driving us forward. Inside, the cabin was filled with remnants of its past. Rusty tools, old furniture covered in dust, and personal items scattered about. Among the debris, we found a table with faded photographs of people we didn't recognize. As we examined the photos, a sudden gust of wind slammed the cabin door shut behind us. The sound of the door crashing made us jump, and panic began to set in. We tried to open the door, but it was stuck. The air grew colder still, and an unsettling feeling settled over us. A soft, whispering sound seemed to come from all directions, though we couldn't make out the words. Shadows flickered in the dim light of our flashlights, and an overwhelming sense of being watched filled the room. My heart raced as I glanced around, feeling a presence that I couldn't quite define, but couldn't ignore either. Suddenly, one of the photographs on the table shifted on its own, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Inside the compartment was an old, yellowed letter that seemed to be a final message from someone desperate for help. As we read the letter, the temperature dropped even further, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the cabin. We decided it was time to leave, and with one last glance at the eerie surroundings, we pushed the door open and fled back to the campsite, the night air feeling like a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. The hidden compartment beneath the photograph was small but contained an old, ornate box. Trembling with a mix of fear and excitement, I carefully lifted the box out and placed it on the table. The others gathered around, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of our flashlights. The box was intricately carved, with symbols and patterns that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. With a deep breath, I opened the box. Inside, we found a collection of old letters, maps, and a small silver locket. The letters were dated from the early 1900s and detailed the lives of a family who had once lived in the cabin. They spoke of the family's love for the land and their fears about the strange occurrences that had begun to plague them. The maps showed areas around the camp where the family had explored, and the locket contained a photograph of a young woman with a serene expression. As we read through the letters, a feeling of sadness mixed with relief filled the room. It became clear that the family had experienced similar disturbances to those we had read about in the diary. However, their letters revealed that they had eventually found peace and had moved away to start a new life, leaving behind the troubled past. Understanding that these were people who had suffered but eventually found solace gave us a sense of closure. The eerie feeling that had haunted us seemed to lift as we realized that we had uncovered a story of resolution rather than one of torment. The presence we had felt earlier was likely the restless energy of people who had sought peace but never fully achieved it until now. As dawn approached, we carefully packed up the box and its contents, leaving the cabin with a newfound sense of tranquility. We returned to our campsite, where the early morning light brought a sense of calm. The campfire crackled cheerfully as we shared our experience, our fears dissipating into the warmth of friendship and the comfort of a story well told. We left the camp that day with a profound appreciation for the history we had uncovered and the peace it had brought to us. The mysterious and unsettling events of the past had been resolved, and we could now remember our adventure with a sense of fulfillment and gratitude. Our summer camp experience had turned into an unexpected journey of discovery and reconciliation, leaving us with memories that would last a lifetime. It was August 5th when we arrived at the secluded campsite in the dense woods of Maine. The forest was quiet, the only sounds being the distant chirping of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot. We were a group of 4, eager for a weekend away from the city, and the serene setting seemed perfect for our escape. The campsite was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The sky above was a brilliant blue, but as we set up our tents and started a fire, a subtle shift in the atmosphere hinted at an impending change. The forest felt both inviting and ominous, its shadows stretching long as the sun dipped lower. As we settled in, I noticed a strange feature about the clearing. There was an old stone circle, partially hidden by overgrowth, near the edge of the site. The stones were weathered and covered in moss, and though they seemed ancient, they were clearly arranged in a deliberate pattern. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off as a remnant of some old campsite or an ancient marker. After dinner, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughing to ease the growing chill of the evening. Yet the stone circle lingered in my thoughts, its mysterious presence tugging at my curiosity. The forest seemed to grow quieter as darkness fell, and the once friendly pines took on a more foreboding character. The campfire's warmth was a welcome comfort against the encroaching cold, but an inexplicable sense of unease settled over me. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the excitement of our adventure. However, as the night wore on and the forest grew even quieter, the feeling persisted, casting a shadow over our otherwise pleasant evening. The next morning dawned overcast, with thick clouds obscuring the sun. We decided to explore the surrounding woods, hoping to shake off the lingering unease from the previous night. The forest was dense and dark, with the occasional ray of light piercing through the canopy. Our laughter and conversation seemed to echo through the trees, masking the oppressive silence that lay beneath. As we wandered deeper into the woods, we came across a small, overgrown trail that seemed to lead further away from the campsite. The trail was barely visible, swallowed by the underbrush and the fallen leaves. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to follow it, hoping it would lead us to something interesting. The path twisted and turned, and after a while, it opened into another clearing. This one was different from the campsites. A strange, unsettling presence hung in the air. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decaying cabin. Its wooden walls were covered in vines, and the roof sagged in places. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up and its door hanging loosely on its hinges. We approached the cabin cautiously, the sense of unease growing stronger with each step. Inside, the cabin was a mess of rotting furniture and dust-covered belongings. Old photographs and letters were scattered across the floor, their edges curled and yellowed with age. Among the debris, we found a diary similar to the one from our previous camp, its cover worn and pages brittle. Opening the diary, we discovered that it belonged to a man who had lived in the cabin in the early 1900s. His entries spoke of strange noises and an overwhelming sense of dread that plagued him and his family. The diary described an increasing number of unsettling occurrences, unexplained sounds at night, shadows moving on their own, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. As we read, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to grow colder. My breath became visible in the dim light of our flashlights, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A strange sound, a low, rhythmic thudding, echoed through the cabin, almost as if something was tapping or drumming somewhere nearby. We exchanged uneasy glances, our earlier excitement now replaced by a palpable fear. We decided to leave the cabin, but the sense of dread clung to us as we retraced our steps back to the campsite. The forest felt even more oppressive now, as if it was closing in around us. The cabin's mysterious aura and the diary's unsettling content had cast a dark shadow over our once carefree adventure. The rhythmic thudding grew louder, reverberating through the cabin and creating an unsettling rhythm that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. We exchanged uneasy glances, our curiosity now heavily tinged with fear. The diary's ominous warnings seemed to come to life as the sound intensified, filling the small, dilapidated space. We followed the noise cautiously, our footsteps echoing off the walls. It led us to a corner of the cabin where a loose floorboard seemed to be vibrating. With trembling hands, we pried up the board, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was an old iron box, its surface covered in strange symbols and rusted with age. The box was heavy, and as we lifted it out, the thudding stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We set the box on a nearby table and gathered around, our breaths visible in the cold air of the cabin. My heart raced as I carefully opened the box, the hinges creaking ominously. Inside, we found an assortment of items: a faded photograph of a young girl, a tarnished locket, and a series of handwritten notes. The notes were written in a hurried scrawl, describing a series of disturbing events. They spoke of someone, presumably the cabin's former occupant, who had tried to contact the other side using occult practices. The notes detailed attempts to communicate with spirits and warnings about something dark that had been unleashed. A chill ran down my spine as I read the final note, which was scrawled in a frantic hand. "They're coming for me." The sense of dread deepened, and we could not shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, causing us to jump. The noise came from the direction of the front door, which we had left ajar. We rushed outside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The clearing was eerily quiet, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The bang had stopped, but the oppressive feeling remained. With the growing darkness and the increasing sense of urgency, we decided it was time to leave. The cabin's mysteries had unsettled us enough, and the forest around us seemed to grow more foreboding with each passing minute. We hurried back to our campsite, eager to leave behind the unsettling presence of the cabin and its dark history. We made a hasty retreat from the cabin, our hearts pounding as we navigated the overgrown trail back to our campsite. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting long, menacing shadows in the dim light of our flashlights. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of twigs. As we reached the campsite, the fire we had left burning was now reduced to a pile of smoldering embers. The night was colder than before, and an uneasy stillness hung over the clearing. We huddled around the remaining warmth of the fire, trying to shake off the lingering fear from our discovery. Despite our attempts to focus on lighter topics, the events of the day weighed heavily on us. The feeling of being watched never quite left, and every rustle in the trees seemed to heighten our anxiety. We discussed the diary's contents and the strange occurrences, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. Each of us had felt the same eerie presence, and it was clear that something unsettling had taken place. As we sat by the fire, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing what was left of our campfire. The cold was immediate and biting, and we struggled to relight the fire as the wind howled through the trees. The darkness felt more oppressive than before, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Just then, we heard a soft, distant voice carried on the wind. It was a faint, whispering sound that seemed to come from all directions. We strained to hear, but the voice was too faint to make out. The sense of dread returned, and we found ourselves huddled closer together, seeking comfort in each other's presence. As the night wore on, we tried to make sense of the voice and the events we had encountered. It became increasingly clear that the cabin and its dark history had left a lingering mark on the area. We could not shake the feeling that the unsettling experiences were connected to the cabin's past and the mysterious notes we had found. When dawn finally broke, the forest seemed to return to its usual quietude, but the sense of unease remained. We packed up our belongings quickly, eager to leave the haunting clearing behind. As we drove away from the campsite, the shadow of the cabin lingered in our minds, a chilling reminder of the mystery we had uncovered. It was November 2nd when we arrived at the secluded campsite in the dense forest of Oregon. The air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the late summer heat we had left behind. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching out like grasping hands against the gray sky. Despite the somber atmosphere, we were eager to embrace the solitude and tranquility of the secluded spot. We were a small group of 3, friends who had known each other since college and were looking for a quiet weekend away. The campsite was situated near a serene lake, its surface reflecting the overcast sky. As we set up our tents and prepared the campfire, the landscape seemed almost melancholic, adding to the feeling of isolation. The lake's edge was lined with fallen leaves, creating a colorful yet decaying carpet beneath our feet. The forest around us was dense, and a thick fog began to roll in as the sun started to set. It was a scene that would have been picturesque in different circumstances, but the encroaching darkness gave it an eerie quality. The wind picked up, causing the bare branches to sway and creak, adding to the growing sense of unease. As the evening settled in, we gathered around the fire and shared stories to lift our spirits. We spoke of past adventures and lighthearted anecdotes, trying to push away the creeping chill that seemed to seep into our bones. Yet despite our efforts, there was an undercurrent of disquiet that none of us could fully ignore. The forest seemed to hum with a quiet, unspoken tension that made it difficult to relax. Around midnight, as the fire began to die down, we decided to turn in for the night. The fog had thickened, and the lake's surface was now a mirror of the darkened sky. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl grew quieter, as if the entire world had fallen into a deep slumber. We retreated to our tents, hoping that a good night's sleep would dispel the unsettling feelings that had accompanied our arrival. The first night was restless. I woke several times, disturbed by strange noises that seemed to emanate from the dark forest surrounding our campsite. Each time I attempted to convince myself it was just the wind or the shifting of the trees, but the unsettling sounds persisted. They were faint but distinct, almost like whispers carried on the breeze. By morning, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing a more subdued but still hauntingly beautiful landscape. The lake was now a mirror of muted colors, reflecting the somber sky. We gathered for breakfast, trying to shake off the remnants of a troubled night. Despite our attempts to act casual, I could see that my friends, Sarah and Mark, were equally on edge. We decided to spend the day exploring the area, hoping that physical activity might help clear our minds. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the eerie atmosphere did not dissipate. The trees seemed to close in around us, their bare branches casting long, spidery shadows. We followed a trail that led us to an old, abandoned ranger station, its wooden structure weathered and sagging. The station had clearly been unused for years, with broken windows and a door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. We poked around the building, finding nothing of particular interest except for some old maps and dusty equipment. It was as if the ranger station had been frozen in time, left to rot quietly in the forest. There was a palpable sense of abandonment, which only added to the eerie feeling we had been experiencing. While exploring the station, Sarah discovered a small, tattered journal hidden in a drawer. The journal belonged to a park ranger from the 1970s, and its pages were filled with notes about unusual occurrences in the area. Strange lights in the forest, unexplained sounds, and sightings of shadowy figures. The entries became increasingly frantic, with the ranger expressing fears about something that he could not quite explain, but felt was dangerous. As we read through the journal, a chill ran down my spine. The ranger's descriptions mirrored the disturbances we had heard the previous night. The more we read, the more it became clear that the ranger had been dealing with the same unsettling presence that seemed to haunt us now. The last few pages of the journal were smudged and difficult to read, but one entry stood out. "They are closer now. I can feel them watching." Feeling both intrigued and unsettled, we decided to return to our campsite and discuss what we had found. The sense of unease had only deepened, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As night began to fall, the fog rolled back in, thickening around us and making the trees appear even more menacing. We sat around the campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced on the nearby trees. Despite the warmth of the fire, the cold from the fog seeped into our bones. We tried to enjoy our evening, but the sounds from the forest grew louder as darkness fell. The whispers that had troubled me the night before returned, now accompanied by the occasional thud, as if something heavy was moving through the underbrush. Sarah and Mark seemed equally disturbed, their eyes darting nervously to the edges of the clearing. The tension was palpable, and our attempts at conversation fell flat as we struggled to ignore the growing feeling of dread. Every rustle in the forest made us jump, and the once comforting crackle of the fire now felt like a fragile barrier against whatever was lurking in the darkness. As we prepared for bed, I noticed that the fog had thickened to the point where it was almost impossible to see beyond the edge of the campsite. The familiar sounds of the forest were now muted, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on us. We retreated to our tents, each of us eager for sleep, but unsure if rest would come easily. The forest outside seemed to close in on us, and as I lay in my tent, the unsettling sounds continued to seep into my consciousness. I tried to focus on anything but the noises, but the whispers and thuds grew more distinct, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate something to us. After discovering the ranger's journal, the unsettling feeling among us grew more intense. The entries described phenomena that seemed eerily similar to the strange noises we had heard. As we left the abandoned ranger station and made our way back to camp, the fog had thickened again, adding a layer of mystery to our surroundings. The afternoon was spent in uneasy silence. Even during daylight, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the fog hanging heavily and obscuring our view. When we reached the campsite, the sense of foreboding was palpable. We attempted to continue with our plans, but the journal's contents weighed heavily on our minds. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, our conversation faltering as the darkness closed in. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I found myself glancing into the darkness, feeling as though we were being watched. Around midnight, a sudden gust of wind extinguished our campfire, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled to relight it, but the wind was relentless. In the pitch-black forest, our flashlights cut through the fog in narrow beams, creating ghostly shapes on the trees. As we fought to reignite the fire, a chilling, low-frequency hum filled the air, vibrating through our bones. The hum grew louder, resonating with an unsettling frequency that seemed to come from all around us. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I realized that the sound was not just an environmental phenomenon. It felt as if something was actively trying to make its presence known, something that could not be seen but was profoundly disturbing. In a moment of sudden clarity, I knew we had to leave the campsite. The unsettling sounds, combined with the oppressive atmosphere, were more than we could bear. We quickly gathered our belongings and prepared to depart. The forest's unnatural silence, a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. We packed up our campsite with a sense of urgency, our movements quick and nervous. The forest seemed to close in on us, the oppressive fog making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The low-frequency hum persisted, vibrating through the air and amplifying our sense of dread. We could no longer ignore the feeling that something unseen was watching us. As we finished loading the last of our gear into the car, a distant, mournful howl echoed through the trees. The sound was unlike anything we had heard before, a deep, resonant cry that seemed to carry the weight of despair. It sent shivers down our spines, and we exchanged worried glances, our previous resolve now tinged with panic. We hurriedly drove away from the campsite, the fog pressing against the windshield as we made our way down the winding forest roads. The eerie hum gradually faded, replaced by the comforting, if not somewhat anxious, rumble of the engine. As we left the forest behind, the tension slowly eased, but the memories of the night lingered. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of our experience. The Ranger's journal remained a chilling reminder of the unexplained events we had encountered. We researched the area, but found no further information about the phenomena described. It was as if the forest had its own secrets, hidden away from the world and never to be fully understood. Though we managed to return safely, the impact of our experience stayed with us. The strange noises, the oppressive atmosphere, and the mysterious hum had left a mark on our collective memory. We spoke less about the details, each of us preferring to avoid revisiting the terror we had felt. The campsite remains a place shrouded in mystery, a location we vowed never to return to. The forest, with its dark secrets and unsettling presence, had offered us a final haunting revelation, a reminder of the unknown and the inexplicable.